Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're just going to give it a minute before we start, but please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us where you're joining us from today, and we'll get started in just a minute. All right, there are so many people joining. We'll give it just another minute. It's so wonderful to see you all in the chat. I can't see you all on my screen, but we'll get started in just a minute. All right, so the number of participants has stopped increasing, so I think we will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our call today. My name is Neda Hussein, and I am a project coordinator with the Erase team here at NLIHC. On today's call, we will hear about local tenant organizing efforts made by our 2022 to 2023 Erase cohort and their work to increase housing stability over the long term. This webinar is the first in a three-part series highlighting the work of our Erase cohort. And on our next calls, we will learn more not only about the efforts made by our cohort to pass tenant protections, but efforts made to sustain emergency rental assistance programs as well. On today's call, we will hear from members of NLIHC staff, as well as from organizers and housing advocates whose work to pass tenant protections would not have been and is not possible without the work of tenant organizers. So as you see on your screen, we have a packed agenda today. First, we will hear from NLIHC staff members Renee Willis and Cindy Betancourt, as well as from NLIHC board member Zella Knight, who will talk about the impact and future of the NLIHC Tenant Leaders Cohort. We will also hear from folks at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, Make the Road Connecticut, Central Legal de la Raza, and the East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy. As a note, we will be saving our Q&A session for the end, where we will have a panel discussion moderated by Erase Senior Project Coordinator Tori Bure. At that time, you will be able to enter your questions into the Q&A chat box. And I see a message to please talk slower, so I will go ahead and do it. Next slide, please. All right, so before I pass it over to our wonderful speakers, I did want to provide a brief overview of the Erase project and the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years. So the Erase project is formally known as the End Rental Arrears to Stop Evictions project, and it was created in January 2021 to ensure that the historic $46.6 billion in emergency rental assistance enacted by Congress during the pandemic has been able to reach the lowest income and most marginalized renters for whom the aid was intended. Today, the Erase project works to build upon the successes of the pandemic-era ERA program to develop permanent programs and broaden renter protections in the future. Next slide, please. In this project, we work with state and local partners, known formally as the Erase Cohort, to ensure that states and localities are not only able to stand up permanent and local emergency rental assistance programs within their jurisdictions, as you can see in track 1, but that states and localities are also able to advance and enforce tenant protections that prevent evictions and promote long-term housing stability. Some of the tenant protections that our cohort is currently working on is the civil right to counsel, eviction record sealing and expungement, just cause eviction standards, source of income protections, and rent stabilization ordinances. When this project first began, we had 9 cohort members, and today we have 24 organizations working across these 2 tracks. And then next slide, please. Oh, my apologies. We can go ahead and get started with our first speakers of the day, which are Renee Willis, NLIHC Senior Vice President of Racial Equity, Diversity and Inclusion, Cindy Bancourt, NLIHC Housing Advocacy Organizer, and Zella Knight, NLIHC Board Member. Thank you so much for joining our call, and I will now pass it over to you all.
Hi, everyone. So nice to meet you. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name again is Renee Willis. I'm with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I serve as the Senior Vice President of Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I'm really thrilled to talk to you today about some of the work that we've been doing here at the Coalition. And really, like over the last several years, we really have undertaken an organization-wide initiative to advance racial equity and inclusion in our policy analysis and strategy, in our internal operations, and really in our relationships. And really with the work that we're doing with our external partners. And we use the acronym IDEAS, IDEAS, really as a framework for this ongoing, racial equity work. And it stands for inclusion, diversity, equity, anti-racism, and systems thinking. And we always, really from the very beginning, and of course, I have a sorry, you all. New system here at work. And so we really, from the very beginning, really realized the importance of centering the voices of residents, of tenants. Public housing tenants, tenants and other federally subsidized housing choice vouchers, or tenants who are holders of housing choice vouchers. And it's really critically important to the work that we do as we seek to defend, affordable housing programs and work for their expansion. And so as part of our, on our board, we have 6 tenant leaders really to help us to pay attention and the right amount of attention to issues and perspectives of tenants and public housing tenants and residents and unassisted and housing of all kinds. And so we were really privileged last year to work with our board members and to, really wanted to center the work that they were doing, also to make sure that, we were doing tenant engagement work that was deep. And so our tenant board, and we have Zella Knight on who will speak to her experience, but they helped us to really focus and to realize that we, again, needed to go deeper with the work that we were doing. So one of the things that we did last year is that we held our first ever tenant and community leader retreat last year in October, and we held it in Albany, Georgia. And it gathered members of the cohort. It was about 15 cohort members, which is really made up of people with lived experience, housing insecurity, who become leading voices and advocates in their communities for housing justice. So the retreat really was to help to introduce, number one, the tenant leaders to each other because they came from all over the country, but also to, really focus on, policy priorities, making sure that we, as a coalition, as an organization, that we were hearing directly from tenants and what the needs were. So we held the retreat, as I mentioned earlier, in Albany. And it was, and we also too brought in several consultants to help facilitate the conversation, as well as to provide training on racial trauma and healing. And the tenant leaders, not only helped to design this particular cohort in the program, but they also helped to shape the tenant forum, the tenant session that we had at the forum last year, well, not last year, but this year, earlier this year. And they also, again, helped to shape some of the policies. And we'll talk a little bit about that when Sydney comes on. But that's our cohort, and we were really excited, and we still are very excited about the work that we're doing with the cohort. We're in the process now of bringing on another cohort that will start in November. But I want to introduce Sydney Betancourt from the NLIHC team, who will talk about the work and some of the work that the cohort has done thus far. Sydney.
Yes, thank you, Renee. And again, my name is Sydney Betancourt, and I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer with the coalition. And I got to, I had the honor of working alongside Renee and all of the other tenant leaders who were part of our inaugural tenant leader cohort for NLIHC and throughout like the past year. And it was a little bit over almost like a year and a half where we kind of like formulated the cohort and had like activities for them to do, to learn and participate in. And the biggest thing that, well, not the biggest, I think the whole experience was pretty huge, but we met once a month every Saturday, again, to kind of like work towards, informing our policy priorities and also helping plan our resident and now called like tenant session at our forum in March. And so through that, we were able to kind of come up with a few things that, tenants really wanted to engage in. They wanted to learn more. We had a session on taking back the land. We had a session on, building community. We also had a lot of different like agency and administration officials come and talk to the tenants so that there was like that space for folks to kind of speak on what their concerns were with the different housing programs. And we also learned a lot from that ourselves. And I would say that the forum is definitely one of like the biggest avenues that we have for folks to kind of come together. So it was really good to see everyone again for the first time in a few years. But outside of the forum, we also had different things that came up throughout the year that the tenant leader cohort got to participate in. The first one happened like a month after the retreat, and it was honestly very unexpected. We weren't really like, ready for it to come up, but the White House did invite a lot of tenant leaders throughout the country, including our tenant leader cohort, to speak on tenant protections and housing affordability at the White House. And so a lot of the folks that were in our cohort were able to attend again in person. Some folks even got to participate virtually. And I think 2 or 3 folks in our cohort got to participate in a panel too, and our own Zelenite, who will be speaking in a second, also got to ask a question virtually. And I'll share this shortly in the chat, but we also got to send an additional follow-up letter with the cohort's name on it that gave like recommendations on like the stuff that they wanted to see. Something else that the tenant leader cohort participated in was also the affirmatively furthering fair housing comment period, which was a little bit earlier this year. And they got to also send their own letter detailing like their concerns. And upcoming right now, we're actually working on the FHFA request for information for just like tenant protections and federally subsidized buildings with federally subsidized mortgages, I should say. And so that's going to be something else. And even though like this cohort's time, if you will, is over and we're moving into a future cohort, they're still going to be very involved, and we're looking forward to making sure that like the alumni network is just as strong as any upcoming cohort that we have. And so with that, we are currently like interviewing folks and also just prepping for the next cohort that we have. And like Renee said, it's going to start in November and it'll be kicked off again with a retreat in October just to get to know everyone. And yeah, we're excited to see how it was. The first cohort was really in charge of like how they wanted things to go, and we're hoping to continue that pattern moving forward. But I'll go ahead and hand it over to our wonderful Zelenite to kind of share her experience in the cohort and also just like her general wisdom on federal housing advocacy.
Thank you, Sid and Renee, for just elevating the work. I am Zelenite, and yes, I'm an NLIHC board member, but most importantly, I am a resident tenant with lived experience, especially in the arena of homelessness. So drilling it down, policy is the policy, but I want to drill it down to the humanistic piece to this endeavor. And so today I'm reflective in regards to the words of India Irie, where she says, I show you my burns, you show me lessons learned. I show you my scars, you show me works of art. I show you a blemish, with every imperfection, you show me your blessing. And so through this endeavor, and a shout out to my cohort family who brought it every single day, despite living through tumultuous times, despite living through crises. We had an amazing time in this effort of not only collectively uplifting our lived experiences, but also seeing the realities of life. Many of our ancestors, many of our foundation holders, many of the folks who we continue to do this work because of, we lost, such as our retreat at the Resora. Many folks do not know that Dr. Charles Sherrod and Shirley Sherrod, they are the epitome of creating the element of what is now known as CLTs, land trusts, community land trusts. Many folks didn't know that. And so this group was blessed to be on that original land that created life for us with lived experience. Many of us watched in peril as Dr. Charles Sherrod transitioned. And so through those opportunities, through those crises and losses, we gained our power, and now we are ready to continue to collectively say and demand, we want affordable housing as a human right. We want to be protected from those ills that continue to hold us back. We want to end racism by giving an equal platform to all, for all. That's what we're supposed to be about, right? We're all supposed to have the comforts of a home, the peace of a home, right? And so we have to always remember the humanistic side to this work and remind the leaders in this endeavor that our voices, those of us who live the experience, who live the pain, who live the challenge, 365 days and 366 when we go into leap year. And so I am ever so grateful to partner and maintain family with my tenant cohort group, with my NLIHC group, with the staff and leaders that are there. We're family, no matter what. And so every journey that each one of our tape, and by the way, to our sister partners, you too are family. You too are part of this endeavor. It's not just reliant on one, it's reliant on all. So as you see behind me, Gloria Richardson would say, no fear. There's no such thing as fear. We're progressing forward, moving forward for all, by all.
That was wonderful. I always feel so honored when Zella comes on to speak at one of our calls, and what a great way to start this webinar. Thank you all so much. As mentioned, we will be saving the Q&A portion after all of our panelists have spoken. So with that, I will now pass it over to Sarah White, staff attorney with the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and Teresa Quintana, housing equity organizer with Make the Road Connecticut. Thank you all so much. I will now pass it over to you.
Thank you all so much for having us. My name is Sarah White. I'm an attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center.
Hi, everyone. I am honored to be here and presenting with Sarah as well. And my name is Teresa Quintana. I am the equity organizer in Make the Road Connecticut.
And today we're going to be talking about a campaign that Teresa and I both worked on in the city of Hartford with tenants aimed at pushing the city to finally prioritize tenants' rights, to put resources towards housing code enforcement and making Hartford, a city of renters, which we're not all the way there yet, but we're working on the path of building tenant power in our city so we can finally shift things. And I wanted to mention at the start, in addition to the Fair Housing Center and Make the Road, we were joined in this organizing, which is ongoing, with other organizations, with the Connecticut Tenants Union, with Connecticut DSA, with our Working Families Party, city councilors, Tiana Hercules and Josh McDum, as well as, of course, the heart of this is that our tenant leaders, whose vision and drive and putting everything at risk is what has made all of this possible. Slide.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hartford organizing context. And I want to let you know that our Hartford community is a multilingual, racial, and ethnic city, where 1/3 families speak primarily Spanish at home. And we want to talk about this because it was very, very important for our movement to include a language justice, because we believe that is a bridge to communicate and to know each other and to heal together. 75% of residents are renters. For renters, median household income is $35,000 and 30% of the city below the poverty line. 2/3 of housing built before 1960, with many rundown 3 to 6 unit buildings. Going into the pandemic, Hartford had just 5 housing code inspector, but 2, the national average for police per resident. And slide.
Teresa, do you want to give some examples of the sort of problems folks were facing?
Sure. One of the things that we actually discovered on the first meetings that we have with their tenants in Hartford was that we cannot communicate each other. We have the same issues, but there is other people who are telling their stories. And we thought it was important to have language justice, because in that way, we're gonna use this as a bridge and understands that we are going through the same situation. And that meeting, we can hear that people were connecting and actually giving solutions, but many of our community members are undocumented, and many of them doesn't have access to some help that our community with Social Security have. But it was important for them to hear on first hands from our undocumented community what their struggle was and to connect. And that day was a change for our community, and we start working together. And it has been a journal, right, Sarah? Because we were trying to get language justice in every place, and Hartford doesn't offer that, not the city of Hartford. And when we went to start complaining with our community members to the tools that usually they gave us to tell us that our tenants have right, but sometimes not. There are many ways to find oppressive. Well, we know the system is completely built to oppress our community. But one of those was that all the complaining forms were in English. And many of our community members didn't know that they can complain in their language. So we have to work all together to make that possible. And well, I am forgetting something else, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, the language justice issues are huge. And just in general, the city has not been prioritizing tenants and has been honestly prioritizing the landlords and developers that don't live there. There were buildings with infestations, places that had elevators broken for a year or more, where elderly and disabled residents would be trapped on upper floors for days and even weeks at a time because it was not accessible. Just, you know, leaks, mold, impacting health, like all of the issues you see with slumlords and with a city full of like aging housing stock that has not been maintained for, you know, many generations, it seems. And where we started with our organizing, I got involved in late 2021 and 2022, and it just sort of began with door knocking, going to bigger buildings where it looked like there might be code violations, talking to tenants about their experiences, and then, you know, organizing some building level meetings to get people talking to each other. And like Teresa said, realizing that they thought they were isolated, but they actually share common concerns and everyone is kind of going through the same thing. Then in the spring of last year, we did a small campaign aimed at the city that got some additional housing and fire inspectors in the budget, but not near enough. Then in the summer of 2022 is where it felt like a lot of the organizing started to kind of come together, and sort of shifting from a strategy of doing the building level meetings to doing these bigger citywide meetings, really initially zeroed in on this one landlord, Avalon, which owned about 25 buildings, larger buildings in the city, and like was identified pretty early on as one of the worst slumlords that was doing absolutely no maintenance. People would call and it would go to a voicemail. They would go to the office and they could see the people hiding behind their desk, doing nothing. So, you know, bringing those tenants together to talk about how we could work towards solutions. And then around that time is when those properties sold to a new landlord that immediately kind of raised everyone's rent, and that sort of kickstarted the campaign. And Teresa, do you want to share about the Weathersfield Ave Tenant Union and the other work we were doing?
Sure, yes, sure, Sarah. One of the things that happened with Weathersfield Avenue, this building was a 23 units, but the same they're the same landlord, and they actually received a letter stating that they have to pay an extra $200. Many of the people who live in this building was Spanish speakers. There were immigrants, and many of them were undocumented. So of course we're gonna hear the fear of no, I don't want to complain, or nothing's going to happen, or that is not our case. But they won't be able to pay that amount of money. At that point, we already knew what was the modus operandi of these slumlords. And so we says, okay, as soon as you receive these letters, that means they're gonna start like, none of them has actually leases. Remember, that was a big thing for us because we thought that they're gonna be able to throw our community members from their houses. Many of them were single mothers. And one of the wonderful leaders of this building says, this is what is happening, how can we move forward? And they start asking for what was the 311, that is the line to complain about issues. They have been living in horrible conditions, rats, cockroach, mold, and many other things. And they were unsafe in their buildings, and their kids doesn't have a place where to play. And then we have the other barriers that when we start like complaining, because we says we have to move forward, because after this letter, they're gonna start like requesting for you to move out of the building, because we were like hearing that many of the slumlords were like evicting people for lapse of time, and that means that they don't have leases. And that is when we start moving, because we knew what was the next step of them. And I think that was very important with this special building, because we have to move before the slumlord, because we knew what was coming. And we work in community because we don't have the forms right in our hands, so where to find it. Sarah was marvelous trying to get those forms in. And they took actions, and they decide to complain, and they decide to sue the landlord in court, but all together. So we walked with them, we as a community, and it was delightful to see how powerful they were. In our community is when we work all together on behalf of all of us, right? Because if they are not good, we never will. and they actually win. Not how they want, but actually after they get their court, they receive a half of the money that they were paying in court, but that's because that is how it's in Connecticut. You can go and pay in court your rent. They receive 50% of that, and they actually can live until next year on April, if I am not wrong, without any lease. But after that, they're gonna be like without any kind of protection. But
So, like-
yes, go ahead,
I was
my
gonna
friend.
say, so with both of these groups of tenants, with these, we were pursuing sort of collective strategies to get the city to do inspections, to pay rent into court, to do like mass fair rent commission complaints, which is a Connecticut process to have rent suspended or lowered to prevent an increase, but then also combined forces to do a campaign against the city, which will be on the next slide. So in the fall, we had a large meetings with tenants together, and folks decided, tenant leaders decided they want to focus on pushing the city to prioritize tenants and take action against these slumlords. And folks jointly developed demands for the city, which were fining landlords to the maximum extent possible, actually hiring enough housing code inspectors so that there would be the capacity to cite landlords for violations and get them fixed. Make sure the rental licensing program was actually functional, which was not operational at the time. Use city funds to make repairs and pay first, last, and security deposits for tenants who needed to move away from slumlords. Making the Fair Rent Commission more accessible and prioritizing language justice through translation and interpretation, and then also meeting regularly with tenant unions. And the tenants decided their first big action to announce the demands would be going in person to the first city council meeting to be held in person since the pandemic. The city was not expecting folks to show up. Usually this is a place where like not many people go to city council meetings. It's like they're not used to having public pressure, having people there, and we completely filled the room, and like around 30 tenants shared their story over several hours. And that's when things started kind of moving with the city. And Teresa, do you want to share like what that meeting was like?
The meeting was very powerful because the community already understand that they don't have to like request or plead. Our community went in demands. They were very powerful and says, hey, listen, you are the one who have to come here and know which problems we have, and you have to resolve it because we put you in that position. So it was to returning the power to the people. And that is how they did. They lead the entire meeting, expressing what they want for their communities, their families, and what they want and how they want to live. And they actually, it was public. They talk about them the entire week, I believe, Sarah, and immediately the city wants to do something about it. So the people power.
Next slide, there's some pictures.
Yes, that is how it look. Next slide, please.
These are some photos from the action of tenant leaders from Avalon, Maple, because some of the buildings got switched, and then also Weathersfield Avenue Tenants Union, and some other folks who rent from smaller landlords in Hartford, really just filling this space. And we got a ton of media coverage, and the next day got calls from the mayor, from most of the city council wanting to meet with the tenants union like immediately. And they did start, after ignoring tenants issues for a couple years, started to move on some of the things tenants were demanding.
Yeah, and actually they can hear our community because we have languages that actually city doesn't offer, but we bring it.
We brought an interpreter because unfortunately the city does not have interpretation at council meetings. Next slide. So in December, we had a follow-up meeting with the city with their response. And it's now going to be up to 16 housing code inspectors. 4 of them are bilingual. Previously, it seems like none of them were. So an improvement from 5. They created a $1 million fund to make emergency repairs and bill the landlord, which has already been used. We heard about one situation yesterday where a stair collapsed. The city allocated $750,000 for legal aid for tenants with conditions issues or who are facing retaliation. And just created in the most recent budget, the $1 million fund tenants were looking for to allow folks to move to pay first, last and security. So slumlords can no longer, hold them hostage in the same way. In some buildings, conditions have improved a fair amount, and there are more violations and citations being issued for housing code violations, more fair and commission hearings being scheduled. And then, the city did commit to have regular meetings with tenant leaders and state funding. The city advocated for and got state funding for municipal receiverships. I think something I learned from this experience is like pushing the city, organizing against the city. We were able to get them to shift money to create some programs, to create more positions, but it hasn't necessarily changed how these systems operate. And what has not happened and needs to happen is actual power sharing with tenants, so they have a say in what these programs look like and how they're running, which is going to take a lot more organizing, long-term organizing and effort, I think, because they don't want to give up their control on how these things operate.
Yeah. And most of, because they know there is the money there and they want to know how they're going to implement it. So our community members are constantly asking questions. They like we always says, they are the leader of this fight. If they have the questions, and if we have to follow up how they have to implement, they have to be in the seat and the table deciding what to do about it and how to better run, because they are the expert.
Slide. So I think our final slide, like kind of lessons learned. Teresa, do you want to start with the first 2?
Sure. The city will use divide and conquer tactic. We already know that they usually use that, but one of the things that we notice is that they usually ask for a name and address, and then and phone number. So then they call them and they try to fix the individual issue. So then the leader won't gonna return to our meetings. So that is how they do. And we noticed that we start like talking in our meetings and people is aware. And actually we have to do that because of course, sometimes we just want to solve something and continues going, but we need to know that that's gonna continue happening. And probably next times when they get something broken, they won't gonna do the same thing.
We also saw divide and conquer with the landlords, with the city wanting to blame the old landlord that had sold most of their property, Avalon, which had held on to one property. That was where the city put the most sort of enforcement effort, sort of making them the bad example. And the new landlord, Maple, as if they, not putting as much pressure on them, portraying them as like potentially a good actor when we knew that they weren't, when the first thing they did when they got these rundown properties was increase people's rent, in some cases by 70%. So another thing to work through, like with tenant leaders, that, the city's going to try this, but we have to stay united regardless of who we rent from.
But we have to be very vocal. So in that way, then the knowledge is spread. So we are like building power because of that too. And we all are like working together, knowing how they're going to act. We need to build deeper relationship and heal together to understand our shared struggles. And that is something, that's why we have language justice. We to understand and using the lens of intersectionality as well, because everybody have different level of oppression, and we need to make sure that our community understand each other and share their struggles and fight together.
And then I'll just share one more. I mean, I definitely think there was a tension we felt between moving quickly, which we in some ways needed to, because people were facing huge rent increases. There was a lot of urgency, and doing that slower work up front of deepening relationships, having a clear organizing structure, that I think if we'd had that in place, our campaign would have been more successful, because we definitely ran into issues with our capacity to, keep track of so many people, keep everyone like together in solidarity, also, work with folks through like their individual issues. And I think if that had been in place, it would have been stronger. We are still organizing and meeting and, talking a lot now about how, the way we organize is in some ways more important than those short-term wins, because it is going to take a movement and a long, the long haul for these systems to change. But I'll just end by saying, like, I think that for me as a lawyer, like, working with organizers, working with, within movements we've been able to win so much more than I could on my own, by asking for things to be changed, by, suing the city or things like that. And, I do feel like building a strong tenants movement in our towns and cities, in our neighborhoods and buildings, is how we're going to shift these systems over the long term.
Yeah, and for me as well, I think we always have to understand that, and the leaders of this fight, and we always talk about this, our community members who are struggling, the ones who are going through, and we always have to live the voices of our friends, and we are here and to fight, and always. So, and I really have the honor to work with Sarah, because we understand that our community members, the ones who's gonna be happy, and we will as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sarah and Teresa. It was incredibly powerful to hear the work that you all have been doing in Connecticut. And with that, I will pass it over to our final speakers of the day. Mihaela Goff, Managing Attorney with Central Legal de la Raza, and Betty Gabaldon, Tenant Organizer with the East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will pass it over to you.
Hi, we only have like a few slides just to keep in the background, but my name is Mihaela Goff. I'm the managing attorney for our tenants' rights team in Contra Costa County. Centro Legal has multiple areas that we help tenants, folks in the community with. So we have an immigration practice, a workers' rights practice. We've been mostly in Alameda County, so like Oakland in California, but a few years ago we expanded into Contra Costa County, which has a very different landscape and like political landscape than Alameda County does. And we've partnered with a lot of great organizations. And one of the bigger partners that we have is eBase. They have a lot of knowledge of Contra Costa County. They've been there for a really long time, and organizers like Betty have helped us create bonds with the community. So this is who I am, and I lead the tenants' rights practice. And so I'll pass it on to Betty just to for introduction and just to talk a little bit about the political landscape of where we work.
Thank you, Mihaela. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Betty Gabaldon, and I'm the manager organizer with eBase. That's East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy in the Bay Area here in California. Our office is also based in Oakland. And like Mihaela said, we expand to working in Concord. That's where I lived and worked. And it's just about an hour away from San Francisco, just for If people that are not familiar with California. So the East Bay Alliance for Sustainable Economy, we advance economic and racial justice, social justice by building a just economy in the East Bay based on good jobs and healthy communities. We also address the root causes of economic injustice by developing alliances among the community, labor, and people of faith, and to build power and create a change with the low-income workers and community of color here in the Bay Area. My work pretty much is outreaching to do outreach to tenants, talking to them, listening to their housing concerns, educating them about their rights, and organizing tenants union with other buildings, and also directing them to the citywide tenants union, which is we call it Todos Santos Tenants Union in the city of Concord. And I would just like to give you a little bit of a quick background of housing here in Concord, how it has been in the last 7 years that we've been here fighting for tenant protections. So Concord is a city that calls itself where family comes first. For the more than a decade, they had been, the city calls itself, what families comes first. However, we know that this is not realistic. People had been, since 2015, had been seeing a significant rise in rent increases. Long-time residents and families had also been displaced with all this rising in rents, harassment, and illegal evictions. Renters in Concord cannot longer live here. They cannot afford to live here. The rents over here, like for a 1-bedroom apartment, it's like around $2,000, $2,400. 2-bedrooms apartments are $2,800, so it's getting pretty expensive here. Renters make up 59% of the city's population here in Concord. And also, like I said earlier, not only tenants are facing rent increases and unjust evictions, but also harassment. This has been a constant threat for many tenants, especially when they are unaware of their rights. And some of the tenants that we work with are also undocumented. So that's more fear, that's created more fear on the tenants that are experiencing this. So back in the summer of 2021, most of the evictions were illegal because we had moratoriums in Contra Costa County and the city of Concord. So a lot of landlords we're not supposed to be evicting tenants, so they start using tactics like harassment to start forcing the tenants to leave or pay their rent. We really saw this is not something new that tenants were facing before, but during the pandemic, this tactics increased, the harassment increased during this time. And eBase and other coalition partners, along with some tenants, we were able to work together and pass an anti-harassment ordinance that became effective last year in July 28th. And this anti-harassment ordinance actually applies to all residential rental units. What is considered harassment in its ordinance is, not getting your repairs done in time, like many of your Sarah and Teresa was just talking about. A lot of the tenants have broken appliances, have mold, bed bugs, cockroaches, all kinds of things. If the landlord doesn't do it on time, on a manner of time, so that's considered harassment. There's other things also in this ordinance, but that's one of the main things too. Currently, we're working on a campaign that is for just cause and rent stabilization in Concord, because we don't have that here. We don't have those tenant protections here in Concord. So we are working on that, on those campaigns right now. But I also wanted to tell you a little bit about myself on how I got involved in this housing justice. I'm also a tenant. I was impacted by this lack of tenant protections. I face a harassment. I face a trauma that an eviction causes. It all started back in 2016 when I received a $400 rent increase. And I really didn't know what to do. It was really scary to come to your house and all of a sudden you find a notice in your door and you're getting a $400 rent increase. So the first thing I did is started talking to my neighbors, door knocking, asking them if they were getting the same rent increase, and they were getting that. But not only that, we also find out that we were all having the same issues, like habitability issues in our units. Again, broken appliances, mold, bed bugs, cockroaches. We were all having the same issues, and we were just not getting the repairs done. So what we did, we called an organization here in San Francisco that helped us get organized, and it's called Tenants Together. They helped us get organized, and we actually did a rent strike in our building. It was really scary, to be honest with you. I didn't know if we were going to be able to win. All of my neighbors were actually wanted to do this, and we won. We won after a month of doing the rent strike and demanding for the rent increase not to keep going and getting the repairs done in our units. The landlord fired the manager at that time, and we started getting the rent. Not the rent increases. We started getting the repairs done in our units, and we didn't have a rent increase for those 2 years, for the following 2 years. But since there is no rent protections, tenant protections in Concord, you could actually get evicted for no reason at all. So the building was sold to a new landlord, and that landlord came and started giving 60-day notices to people. We had already formed a tenants union. So when we noticed that our neighbors were getting rent increases, 60-day notices, we went to the office of this landlord and asked, why are you giving my, this tenants 60-day notices? And he just told us straight up. He said, oh, I don't have to tell you why I'm kicking you out. Just there's no just cause protections. I could just do that. And sure enough, 2 weeks after that, I got my 60-day notice, and it was very hard for me. It was traumatizing for my daughter. It is hard to find another apartment, as many of you know. They asked for 3 times to make 3 times the amount of rent. Nobody makes that amount of rent. It's like $6,000 or $8,000 now with the rents. And they asked for first and last month and deposit. It's very hard to find a place. So all of that caused me a lot of stress, and that's the reason why I decided to get more involved on tenant rights and also educating other tenants about their rights and fighting to get these tenant protections in Concord. I think Sarah mentioned earlier that a lot of times tenants feel alone. They feel ashamed also of sharing this type of stories, especially when you have, pests in your apartments, and they don't feel okay sharing this kind of stuff. So my job is I share my story with them. I let them know, like, I went through the same thing, that it's okay to share your story, not to be afraid anymore to speak up. And it's very hard, to be honest with you. It is hard to talk to tenants. A lot of the times they're afraid, but once you start creating that relationship with them, they open up to you and they want to work more with you. I think that's what helps a lot when you're trying to build those tenants unions in those buildings. It's the one-on-one relationship you have with those tenants. Women in particular, I found out that those are the ones, mothers, they are the ones that really fight for their families. They are the ones in the front lines talking about how they really need time to spend with their kids. So it's very powerful to see these amazing women going to city council and talking to them like, we need time to spend with our kids. This is not fair. So recently we just developed a 6-session leadership development institute with 11 tenants from all over the city. We helped create a community. What we did was, in those 6 sessions, what we did, the first meeting was to show them how important it is for them, how important housing it is for them. And the second session was to take care of their bodies through meditation and mindfulness. A lot of the times we just like running around working 2 to 3 jobs, taking care of our family, taking care of our kids, and we don't stop and take care of our bodies. So the second session that we did on the Leadership Institute was for them to take care of their bodies through meditation and mindfulness. The third session was about political education, letting them know what's going on in the city, and also prepare them to go door knocking to bring awareness about the campaigns that we're doing right now, which is rent stabilization and just cause, and also bringing resources about the tenant legal clinics that we have in Concord with the Centro Legal. And the last one was actually going out there and door knocking, bringing all these resources to the tenants. That was their homework that they needed to do, and do public comment at City Council to put more pressure on them to pass this ordinance about rent stabilization and just cause. We actually really happy that all of this was a success. All 11 tenants actually finished all the 6 sessions. We are meeting twice a month in person. We were doing all of this, all of the meetings we're doing through Zoom because of the pandemic. And now, I went to in-person meetings, which really help a lot to be able to to feel each other, to connect with each other is so much different than being, in front of the screen. We actually preparing to start another Leadership Institute in September, and really excited to work with, the lawyers from Centro Legal. And this is, I want to share a story about how exciting it is to also work with attorneys, because it helps empower tenants to not be afraid. And this is the story of Ignacio. He is a tenant who received a 6-day notice because of substantial renovations that landlords say they're going to do in the units. And we all know that a lot of the times this is just another tactic for them to get the tenants out and raise up the rent. All they do is just paint the walls of the apartment and jack up the rents more. So this tenant got a 6-day notice. He was able to find a place actually before the 6-day notice expired. And when he came back to get all the rest of his stuff, he found out he had already been locked out. The landlord had already changed the locks of the apartment. He called the tenant legal clinic, the hotline that we have for that. And Centro's attorneys wrote a letter for him. We, with faith leaders, allies, and other tenants, we walked to the office of this property owner to demand for him to open up the apartment. So Ignacio was able to get his, so he could get his all of his stuff back. But we realized that they had already disposed of them. They had already thrown them away. So the landlord, when he received the letter that the attorneys wrote, he got scared. He got scared when he saw that, and he saw all the community behind Ignacio supporting him. He was able to get around $8,000 back from that. He didn't even have to go to court. But yeah, this is one of the stories that I like to talk about and see the power of when you work together with attorneys and organizers in supporting the tenants. I don't know, this is really a powerful story for me to share. And I'll let Mihaela share another story.
Sorry, we can move to the next slide too. I think it's really powerful when we work together. I believe the organizers are really good at building trust with the tenants and getting them together in one space, and getting them to care about the issue. And where we come in is to provide just the legal information. Sometimes tenants listen to the organizers and they don't know for sure whether or not they have those rights. And so for some reason they like to hear it from attorneys. And so I think what is helpful is, for instance, we did a Know Your Rights workshop at one of the sessions for the Institute, and the tenants had a lot of great questions stemming from tenants' rights, but as well as they had other legal questions about like employment rights. And even though I'm not a workers' rights attorney, I was able to provide them resources. And so I think that was really helpful. We also partner with eBase at our own workshops. I think it's very helpful when we have our clinics to have organizers there. That way the tenants that just have some habitability questions, or tenants where we help write letters, then they know that they can also talk to people like Betty, and so they can leave the workshop with their legal questions answered, but also feel empowered that they can then go home and organize their neighbors and have other tools in their toolbox to preserve their rights as tenants. So I think having this partnership has been very, very helpful to create trust and knowledge with the tenants and to empower them. So yeah, the Know Your Rights workshop was very, very successful. But yeah, is there anything else that you'd like to add, Betty? I think that pretty much covers everything.
Yeah, no, I think that's amazing that, yeah, Michaela, you're right. Sometimes the tenants they don't listen to the organizers, but when they hear that from the attorney, it's different. So working together really makes it, I feel like it's a success so far. And then tenants feel like supported in both ways, like with the organizers and the attorneys. But yeah, I think that's it for us.
Thank you both so much. Betty, thank you for being so open and sharing your story and experience with us. With the final minutes left, I will pass it over to Tori, our Erase Senior Project Coordinator, who will lead our Q&A session. So Tori, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Netta, and thank you so much to all the wonderful panelists who gave a great perspective of all the organizing efforts you all are doing. I have one question that I would really love to ask you all, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience. So I would, if you could focus on or identify one strategy that you would identify for success, for tenant organizing success. So what's like one key strategy that helps you all be successful in your tenant organizing efforts? I guess it's a better way to phrase that. And that's for anyone who wants to go. I see some folks posting in the chat too. So thank you for that. But Betty, Sarah, Mihaela, Teresa, would love to hear from you guys.
I'm sorry, Tori, what's the question again?
Sure. So one key strategy for successfully organizing tenants around these housing issues.
I think for me, it has been like the one-on-one relationship with the tenants. That has been one of the success. I mean, the key successes to do that. Because just going door knocking and talking to tenants is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
They don't know who you are. You're just a stranger. But building those relationships really helps.
That makes a lot of sense. Anyone else?
I agree with you, Betty. I think also, like, in addition to that, having meetings where tenants are building relationships with each other and seeing that they have shared concerns and are dealing with very similar things. Like, I think there's often been like a moment I felt in meetings where that starts to shift and people start thinking as a group, thinking collectively rather than so much as individuals, which is so key. And then moving from there to hopefully develop a shared, or at least like overlapping analysis of power, of who the landlord is, what the power is that, they as tenants have, and, how they can shift that.
And to add that, I can tell that to understand as an organizers that our community members are trying to survive every single day. Many of them have more than one or two jobs. So try to give them all the accessibility, transportations, like, I don't know, put all of them together in a WhatsApp group for them to continue communicating, like sharing their what is happening in their buildings, to build power through social media, through WhatsApp. And I think that's another thing. I don't want to pass it.
That's great. Awesome. And I'm seeing some comments in the chat too about organizing, leading through the lens of living experiences, honesty and keeping your word, and consistency. So thanks also for, I know we have a lot of tenant organizers joining us on this call. So thank you for your feedback on that too. That's great. I have a question coming in the Q&A about, do you have any advice on how to start a citywide tenant union? And I think that might be a question for our Connecticut folks.
I have a lot of thoughts on this. I think, just to give some context for Connecticut, there was a strong tenant movement in the past in Connecticut. I've read old legislative histories and learned about all these rent strikes and tenant unions, but by the time I got here, there really was not much of a tenant movement. So we've really been starting from scratch, which I know from living in other places is a situation a lot of folks have been in the pandemic, even nationally. So if that's your situation, that's fine. I think the biggest piece of advice I have is one, it is about relationships, and of course, individually inviting people into a space, having those focusing on the longer term relationships rather than kind of immediate wins necessarily. And two, being open to experimentation, because we have tried all sorts of different things over the last 2 years or so that I've been involved in tenant organizing in Connecticut. A lot of it depends on local context. A lot of it is going to fizzle out, and that's okay. And I think that's part of the process. But, for example, I mentioned we tried the building level meetings for a while, which in some places have gone places, other places haven't. Then did the sort of landlord focus, and now are in this new phase where we are creating sort of like a citywide tenant union where there's a shared space around training, learning together, building our analysis together, but also doing some building-based organizing. So being open to experimentation and knowing that even if it feels like things fail, it's not really a failure. That's part of the process. And oftentimes you still have those relationships with tenants coming out of it. There are folks still involved who are some of the first people we door knocked. And it's been a long journey together, but that's kind of what it will take, I think.
That's great. Thanks so much, Sarah. Betty, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, piggyback with what Sarah just said right now. I really think that yeah, the Citywide Tenants Union, it was in 2019 when it was formed, and it was just right around before it was before the pandemic. It was in November 2019, and the pandemic started the next year. So all the tenants that were, part of that tenants union, kind of it was something, and then all of a sudden the pandemic hit, and everybody just, went their own way. So it was really hard for those 3 years, during the pandemic. It was hard because also we couldn't do it in person. It was all through Zoom, and it was really hard for the organizers to even talk to tenants. And now that we're finally going back in person, little by little going back in person, the Leadership Institute that we created, I think that helped to, like what Sarah was saying, create again those relationships with, with the tenants that are, that are still there in the city. And yeah, I think that that's what happened. And now that we have that core group, that also is gonna help us, get more the word out and talk to more tenants. And then now with the second institute is also, I think it's gonna help. And just also to mention, I think that as I mentioned that stipends for the tenants for their time. A lot of the tenants are working 2 to 3 jobs. they don't have the time to, they go to work, they come home, take care of the family. They don't have the time to do that, to even do something else. So stipends really work for tenants if we want them to get organized and learn about their rights and also fight for tenant protections.
That's great. Thank you. Those were great answers to that question. Excellent. So I know that we have I think a couple minutes, 2 minutes, few minutes left. Oh, I see. Let's see. One more question here. How did the outreach for the program get started? And I think also, how did they get started? How did you get started organizing the tenants? I don't know, Dwayne, I don't know if you're referring to the unions. You mean the unions? How did they get started, or any clarification? Yes. How did the unions, the outreach for the unions get started?
Well, in our case, in Make the Road Connecticut, what we whether to tenant unions, how they call themselves, but the organized tenants of these buildings, was very important for them to, like, as soon as one of them received this letter, they have to share with other neighbors. So it's like knocking the door of your next door neighbor and say, hey, this is what is happening, but I won't be able to do it. What's going on with you? And they start like sharing the information and looking for the other neighbors in your buildings. So I think everything started when with you. If you are a tenant and you want to organize your building, you can go and knock the doors of your neighbors and ask if they are going through the same injustice. And you build power together, and then go and look for organizations and go and look if your building, if the landlord of your building have another building, try to connect with them. And you continue building power until you decide to make a union. I think everything started with just one person, and then they can build a big union.
That's great, Teresa. Oh, Betty?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. For us, it has worked with the tenant clinics, the tenant legal clinics that we have. The tenants come, they call the hotline. They come and get a legal information. But at that moment, we also ask them, have you talked to your neighbors? If not, then can we go door knock on your neighbors? Because if this is happening to you, I'm pretty much sure that it's happening to your neighbors too. Sometimes they say no, sometimes they say yes, but when they say no, then that's when we offer to go. Well, I offer to go and help them door knock with the neighbors and bring resources to ask if this is also happening to them. And I'm talking about like maybe habitability issues or even rent increases. But yeah, a lot of the outreach starts also at the tenant clinics and also door knocking, but tenant clinics also help.
That's great. That's a great point too. So I see we're at time. I'm going to turn over to Netta to wrap us up and share our resources. So thank you to all our wonderful, excellent panelists for getting on today. And Netta, turning it over to you.
Thanks for that, Tori. So with our final minute, I want to thank our panelists again for joining us today. And thanks to you all for coming to this webinar. I want to highlight that our next webinar will be held on July 27th from 3 to 4:15 p.m. Eastern Time. If your question was not answered today, I'm going to drop my email in the chat, and I will make sure that it gets to the right person. But yes, there are resources available on the Erase website. There you can read more about the briefs and the toolkits that we have released. And with that, I just want to say thank you again, and I hope you all enjoyed the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us here.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.